Well, good morning. Hey, thank you for that little moment for us. It really is an honor to serve as one of the pastors here. I know Dustin feels the same way. So thank you for that. If you haven't been with us before, we are in the middle of a series called Limitless Grace. We're looking at two of the minor prophets in the Old Testament and sort of seeing God's grace through each of those lenses. So we did the book of Jonah a few weeks ago. If you missed any of that, I would encourage you to go listen to it. And now we're working through the book of Hosea and looking at God's limitless grace through the book of Hosea. Now, if you've read Hosea before, and as I've read it, one word that keeps coming up is this idea of discipline. Discipline isn't really a fun thing to talk about, but it comes up over and over again. You know, I think back to being a kid, and I can't think of a worse feeling than being a kid and knowing you're in trouble, knowing you've messed up, but in that period where you're waiting on your punishment to come. It's the worst feeling because the wait is what's really torture in that moment. So for me, I don't know what it looked like for you. For me, I'd get home from school, 3:15, 3:30, and it might have been a day where I'd messed up. I'd done something wrong, got caught in something. I came home, I wasn't in trouble a lot, but I came home in trouble. Now, minor offenses, mom can handle those, right? You get home, you get in trouble, it's all done. My parents are here, they're wondering where I'm gonna go with this, so this will be fun. But occasionally, you get that phrase that really no kid ever wants to hear, and that phrase was, we'll talk about this when your dad gets home. You're thinking, no, let's talk about it now. Let's do it now. I don't want to wait till that. And it's not that dad was really any more harsh than mom. It was just the waiting that was so hard. Knowing I had messed up, knowing something was coming, but not knowing what that was going to be. It was one of those waits where it's like, it felt like it took forever for dad to get home, and at the same time it went by way too quick, if you know what that's like. It was the waiting on discipline that was the worst part. Now the funny part is, once dad got home and we dealt with it, the discipline happened, whatever it was. After that, we always got a hug and an I love you, and suddenly everything felt lighter in the room. Suddenly everything felt better. Suddenly the relationship actually felt a little better than it was before the punishment happened. Almost to the point where you'd almost be thankful for it, thankful that you went through that because of how it improved things at home. And it was a hard way to get there, but sometimes it took discipline to get back to the right relationship. You know, I think about that now, and I still get that feeling when I mess up, when I hurt someone, when I wrong someone. That feeling of knowing I've done wrong, knowing there's going to be some consequences, some form of pain involved with that, but not knowing what it is and sort of avoiding it and worrying about what's going to happen. It's that feeling when you've wronged someone and you start to avoid them. Even though you've hurt them, you start to avoid them. You don't make eye contact when you're in the same room. You find a different circle of people to hang out with because you feel like I've wronged them. I've done something so wrong. There's no way they could ever forgive me. There's no way we could ever get back to the kind of a relationship we had, so I'm just going to avoid them. And we do this with people, but we actually sometimes do this with God as well. Have you ever found yourself in the middle of sin or feeling like you've really screwed up and you don't want to pray because you just feel like, man, I can't be talking to God when I'm in this condition? Or maybe you feel like you couldn't come to church or you couldn't really get involved in church because wherever you're at in your life, you think, I'm really not there yet. I really need to clean some stuff up. I really don't know if there's a way I could get back in that kind of relationship with God. The funny thing is, sometimes we look at the depth of our sin, we start to wonder if there's any way back, or maybe we do see a way back, but that way looks so hard, so painful, we just don't want to go there, so we stay where we're at. But what if you were to find at the end of that road, that hard road of discipline, something better? Sort of a new relationship. It's deeper, it's better than what you had before, because discipline brought you back. So we're in Hosea today, but before we go to Hosea, I want to take you back a few hundred years before that to the time of Moses. Now you might be wondering, why look at Moses in a study on Hosea? Well, if you remember, Hosea was God's prophet. His calling was to protect and guard over that covenant God had made with his people. Now that covenant was sort of established and communicated in the time of Moses. And so if you go to the book of Deuteronomy, you have Moses speaking to the people of Israel as they prepare to enter the promised land. And in Deuteronomy, he's giving them all the commands and all these reminders of how they're supposed to live in that land and when they get there, what they're supposed to do. And he also gives them some warnings of what could happen to them if they forget who gave them that land, if they forget who they're in relationship with. And he gives them these warnings. And in Deuteronomy 4, he tells them, if you turn away from your God, if you do evil, if you worship other gods, some things are going to happen to you. And here's what he said in Deuteronomy 4:26. He said, if you do that, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will soon utterly perish from the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. You will not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you. And there you will serve gods of wood and stone, the work of human hands, that neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. Now, if you read that, you see a serious warning. Utterly perishing, being utterly destroyed, being scattered, being few in number. That means they're going to lose their homes. They're going to lose their livelihoods. A lot of people are going to lose their lives if they do what Moses was warning them about. And you might see that punishment and think, there's no coming back from that. You can't recover from that. And you might even ask, well, why would God do that to his people? As he's leading them into this promised land, he gives them this warning. But why would he do that to them? So as we return to Hosea, we come to a time where the people of Israel had done exactly what they were warned not to do. And they're on the brink of losing that land that God had brought them to. And as God's prophet, Hosea is going to show them their sin and the consequences of it. To illustrate that, God had asked Hosea to take a wife at the beginning of chapter 1. If you were with us last week, that's what we covered, to take this wife named Gomer. But it was an unusual command in that he was commanded to take a wife of whoredom or prostitution. And her name, Gomer, and her sin represented the sins of Israel, what they had done wrong, how they had turned from God. And Hosea is called to live that out. And so in chapter 2, we'll start to see God's case against his people and the consequences that they would have to suffer for what they've done. And so as we come to chapter 2, I want you to picture a courtroom. And on one side stands God. And he's got all these accusations, and he's going to outline everything Israel has done wrong. So on the other side stands Israel, almost like two spouses in divorce court, arguing their case. But really, it's God who does the arguing. And that's where we start in chapter 2, verse 2. He says, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. So what you see here as he starts in verse 2 is almost like a father looking to his children as witnesses of what's happened. He's reminding them, you've been God's people, you've received mercy. And then he calls on them to plead with their mother. Now, this word plead is often translated accuse because it's the type of pleading that belongs in a court of law. So God is bringing these accusations against his people. And then in the next few verses of Hosea 2, he'll state his case against her. And now, unfortunately for Israel, he's not just the one stating the case, he's also the judge. So as he states his case, he's also going to be handing out their punishment as the judge. So we're going to summarize a bit in chapter 2, but let's look first at what they've done. What has Israel done wrong? What are their crimes against God? Well, in chapter 2, the first thing you can see clearly is that Israel is guilty of adultery. Verse 2, he refers to her whoring and her adultery. Verse 5, he says she played the whore. Verse 13, he speaks of Israel adorning herself with rings and jewelry to go after other lovers. You see terms like this quite a bit when God's prophets speak, and the idea is always the same. Israel belonged to him. They were in relationship with him. They were called to worship him alone, to trust in him alone. But what they did was they didn't trust him. They often trusted in other nations. They trusted in other gods, and they turned to them. And the picture God gives of that is adultery. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Think about the hurt and the pain that comes with adultery. You've got two people who have committed to share all of their physical, emotional intimacy with each other. They make this vow, and suddenly that's broken. That trust is broken. That vow is broken. And it's one of the hardest things to come back from. It's painful. It takes a long time. my guess is most of you in some way have been affected by it. You've seen the repercussions of it. You've seen how hurtful it is, how much pain there is when adultery happens. And that's the picture God gives for what his people have done to him. They've betrayed their relationship with him for different gods. And if you were to read through the Old Testament, look at 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you'll see this happen. You'll see king after king in Israel setting up places to worship false gods, or seeing that it's going on and not stopping it. The people of Israel, they give their hearts and their minds and their bodies to things other than their one true God. And here in Hosea, God is standing as a husband saying, you've betrayed me, you've broken that trust, you've committed adultery, and it has to stop. Along with that, they've also forgotten how good God has been to them. Verse 8, God says Israel has forgotten all that he had given them. He says, she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold. See, in Hosea's time, this was a short time period in Israel of prosperity, of abundance. They'd had good harvests. They had had a time of relative peace. And so they had a lot of things. A lot of things had come their way. They were in a really good place. The problem was that by this time, they had forgotten that it was God who gave it to them. Remember, we looked at Deuteronomy. Throughout Deuteronomy, you see God making these promises of grain, wine, oil. It represents his abundance that could only come from him. But as they received that, they looked at it as other gods providing for them. It says all that God gave them at the end of verse 8, they used for Baal. They took everything he had given them, instead of in thanksgiving offering it back to him, instead of using it to worship him, to do more for him, they used it to be thankful and worship other gods. You know, as parents, one of the first things we teach our kids is how to say thank you. So if my kids open a present, and I'm sure you're the same with your kids, as they're opening it, you'll hear Ginger and I saying, "What do you say? What do you say?" And that's the reminder, right? To look at the person who gave you the gift and say thank you. And it's polite, of course, but we want them to recognize that, hey, you didn't earn that. The only reason you have that gift is because that person loved you and cared enough to give it to you. So I want you to look at that person and recognize who gave you the gift. And see, when we let other things take the place of God, it's like not saying thank you. It's not recognizing where the gift came from, the thing he's provided with us. And we use those things sometimes for other things that we've placed ahead of him. We give more of our time to our hobbies instead of him. We use our money on things that we might not need instead of giving it back to him. We use our energy and our resources to ensure our own comfort and security rather than trying to further his kingdom. You know, we don't worship Baal like these people did, but we definitely take what God has given us and we give it to other things that we've placed ahead of him. And that's what Israel had done. They had taken this special relationship they had with God, all the benefits of it, all the intimacy and provision, and they had turned away from him to worship other gods. So that's their crime. And it's clear that they're guilty. You can read the Old Testament, you can read Hosea, and you can tell they're already guilty. So what's their punishment? What's their discipline? What's the sentence for this crime? Well, you can see their sentences and their punishments sort of outlined throughout chapter 2. And you can tell where they're at because he uses this word, therefore, to give them a sentence. And so he would say, this is what you've done, here's what you've done, therefore, here's your punishment. And so their first sentence comes in verse 6, and this is where God says, therefore, behold, I will hedge her away with thorns, I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. What he's describing here with this hedge of thorns, this wall against her, is sort of the type of punishment appropriate for an animal who needs to be confined, an animal that tends to wander off from its owner, to do the wrong thing. So in my house right now, we have a 10-week-old puppy named Baxter. And you would see him and you would think he's really cute. He's not that cute to me right now. If we were to let Baxter roam freely right now, he would chew on everything in the house, except the chew toys we bought him. He'd go to the bathroom in the house. If we said, okay, we're going to let you outside, he would get lost and wander off immediately. He just can't handle that type of freedom right now. So right now, we're not there. He's confined to a small area that he can't get out of because that confinement is sort of a necessary lesson right now until he learns. And so here in Hosea, that's what this punishment is going to do for Israel. The point of this allegory is this prediction of captivity and exile for the people of Israel. They couldn't handle the freedom they've been given. They used it poorly, so they'd have to be confined for a time. The second sentence, it's similar, but it's characterized by reversals. Look at verse 9. He says, "Therefore I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness." He goes on from verse 9 and 10, 11, and 12 to list more of the things that would be taken away from them. And this is God taking away the things that he had given them, because when he did provide for them, he couldn't really trust them with what he had provided. We have friends who have a daughter, same age as our daughter, and a couple years ago, they told me about a really interesting way that they disciplined their daughter. She'd gotten caught in a lie, a fairly serious lie, and they really wanted to teach her a lesson. But they didn't yell, they didn't spank. What they did was they took everything she didn't absolutely need out of her bedroom. So toys, stuffed animals, games, all of it out of the bedroom. She had her bed and the clothes she needed, and that's it. And the idea was, hey, we couldn't trust you with the things you've been given. You couldn't handle all the good things you have, so we're taking those away for a time until you can earn our trust back. Now, it might sound a little harsh, it might sound a little strange, but I guarantee you she did not forget that lesson. And so that's what's going on here. This is in Hosea, God reducing his people to dependence. And that would serve as a reminder of where all those good things had come from. Now, the third sentence, it comes in verse 14, but it's kind of shocking based on what's happened so far. So we know he's going to put them in captivity. He's going to take away everything from him, just like they had been told, just like Moses had promised all the way back in Deuteronomy. And so you hear these punishments and you might think, well, they've finally done it. They've finally sinned so much that they can never get back in God's good graces. He's done with them. And so you get to the third sentence and you're sort of expecting the nail in the coffin. You're expecting this final judgment. But that's not what he does. Look at verse 14. He says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and I will bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And there I will give her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt." So after he's punished her, after he's handed out these sentences, he says he will allure her. He'll speak tenderly to her. He starts using romantic language here. This is language used in the Old Testament to talk about winning back a lost love. And this is where we start to see how God plans to show his grace to his people. He's going to discipline them by taking them on a path of exile and desperation. But at the end of that path stands God ready to bring them back into a deeper, closer relationship. You know, he references this valley of Achor in verse 15, and you might not know what that is, but that's a reference to a place. It stands for Valley of Trouble. That's what Achor means. In Joshua 7, as the people of Israel were working their way into the promised land, fighting battles and trying to do everything exactly as God told them, that so that they would trust in him and inherit the land he had promised them. At this Valley of Achor, a group of people within the Israelites sinned, and they sinned so badly, and they went so against what God had asked them to do that this whole family ended up having to be stoned to death. Imagine, that's a dark, dark place. That's a bad memory. So anytime you look back at this Valley of Achor, this valley of trouble, you'd see darkness, you'd see pain. But he gives them a picture of the nature of his grace in that he turns that dark place, that valley of trouble, into a door of hope. And in verse 16 and 17, as we go on, we see that this will turn them away from worshiping those false gods and bring them back into a relationship with God. In the next few verses, he elaborates on the nature of that new relationship and all the ways it'll be better than it was before. Verse 18, he'll establish a new covenant. "I will make for them a covenant on that day with the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the creeping things of the ground. And I will abolish the bow, the sword, and war from the land. And I will make you lie down in safety." Verse 19, he will also betroth his people. He says, "I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness, in justice, in steadfast love, and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord." The word betrothed doesn't mean a whole lot to us today because it's not a common practice, but in this culture, To be betrothed was a big deal. That's when the groom had paid this final price for his bride. That's when it was sealed. That's when it was viewed as done. The relationship is now permanent. And that's what God says he will do with his people. I will betroth you to me forever. And he'll accomplish that, and it'll be characterized by some important words there. It'll be accomplished by righteousness, justice, steadfast love, mercy, faithfulness. And because of those things, in verse 21, you start to see another reversal happening. He says, in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land. And I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God. Remember in chapter 1, the names of Hosea's children. Jezreel, meaning God sows. Lo Ruhamah, meaning no mercy. Lo Ami, not my people. So after they've gone through their punishment, after they've gone through that discipline, there will be a day when those things are all reversed, when God will bring them back into that relationship with him. And this is where we start to see the uniqueness of Hosea, because God calls Hosea to actually live this out in his own life. So in chapter 1, he asked Hosea to go marry Gomer, this wife of whoredom, this wife of prostitution. In chapter 3, he tells Hosea to go bring her back. She's been unfaithful. She's left you. It's time to go get her back. So chapter 3, verse 1, and the Lord said to me, speaking to Hosea now, he said, go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. So in verse 1, Hosea gets his orders from God, and the key word is love. That word for love is used 4 times in verse 1. Hosea is commanded to go love this woman who has been unfaithful, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel. And the first point in Hosea's story here, it's important, so don't miss it. It's that God never stopped loving his people, even when they were being disciplined. He loved them when they were unfaithful, and he will continue to love them through the pain they have to go through. If he didn't love his people, he wouldn't even put them through the discipline. Remember, David taught us last week, God isn't a payback God. That's not why we have discipline, for God to pay us back. It's to bring us back to him. That's why Hebrews 12 says God disciplines those he loves. He disciplines them as sons. So in chapter 3, verse 1, God tells Hosea to go love her in that way. So what does Hosea do? He goes and gets her. Look at verse 2 and verse 3. He says, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. And I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. And so the second thing to make note of here is that a price had to be paid to redeem this woman. He gives this sort of itemized bill of sorts to say, hey, whatever it is, I'm willing to pay to get her back. And in doing that, he says, you can dwell as mine for many days. There's this bringing in of this woman so she can heal and recover so that the relationship can be what it was before. And this is all to show what God plans to do with his people. Look at verse 4. For the children of Israel shall dwell many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness in the latter days. So this is the difficult path Israel's going to have to walk. They're going to lose their leaders. They're going to lose their places of worship. But notice that in that cleansing, you also see those household gods being taken out, those things that sort of lured them away from worshiping God. So it's a painful cleansing, but it's a necessary one, and it's one that will cause them to return. And after they've gone through it, they'll seek the Lord and his anointed one. And when they do that, they'll spend the latter days in his goodness. You know, when Hosea speaks about David, their king, he's looking ahead to a time when a descendant of David would come and restore his people for good. He's looking ahead to when Jesus would come and redeem his people once and for all. It'd be a hard road to get there, but it had to be that way, and God had kind of told them this from the beginning. So remember back to Deuteronomy 4 where we started. Moses had laid out all these warnings. If you do this, if you do evil when you go into the land, all these things are going to happen to you, and it's going to be rough. It's going to be painful. But he promised not to leave them there. Deuteronomy 4:29, from there is that place of discipline. There is that place that once you've had everything taken away from you, once you've been through that captivity, once you've gone through through that pain, from there, you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search after him with all your heart and with all your soul. When you're in tribulation and all these things come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. See, God sends these reminders throughout his word that no matter how bad you mess up, no matter how hard you try to fight him or ignore him, no matter how ugly your sin is, you will never be able to outrun his grace. You can't ever and won't ever out-sin his love and his mercy. Because of our sin, we sometimes have to be disciplined, and that discipline is a hard road, but that discipline is what brings us back to him. I spoke to a man a couple of weeks ago in our church now, and he's walked a hard road over the last year. He found himself in a dark place several months ago. He had grown up in church, always kind of been involved, but never really had a faith of his own. He had never really put his own faith in Jesus. He was a good dad and a good father for decades, but then they had this little family crisis, and it triggered some past trauma in his life, and suddenly he found himself dealing with severe depression and anxiety. So because of that, he drank too much, he started sleeping less, and at a certain point, he decided, I don't want to be married anymore. So he told his wife, I don't want to be married anymore, I'm leaving, I want a divorce, and he was gone, planning to never really see her again. And so after he did that, he sought out other people to try to fill that need. He was unfaithful to his wife. He wouldn't have any contact with her. Family relationships were strained. He started to lose friendships. He thought this was what he wanted, but it kept getting worse and worse. The pain kept getting worse and worse. At one really low point, he found himself at a party, looking around, and it was so bad, and he was in such a low place that he said, if God came back right now, I don't think he'd find me. He thought he had out-sinned God's grace. He thought he had fallen too far to have a relationship with God. His sin was too much for God to forgive. And all that pain he was experiencing, all that sorrow, he just thought that's further confirmation that I'm too far from God. So as the date approached for them to finalize their divorce, and he found himself more and more broken, for 3 days leading up to the divorce, he was weeping, broken over this, but he didn't see any way back. But it was in that moment, on his knees, for the first time, that he felt God's presence, and he put his faith in Jesus. But even then, even doing that, he thought in that moment, there's no way my wife will ever take me back. After what I've done, after all the ways I've hurt her, there's no way she would take me back. And not 10 minutes later, he got a text from her the night before their divorce saying, hey, are you sure we want to go through with this? Are you sure? It was a small, small moment of grace, but it was enough for him to see a road back. Now, that road's been hard. They've had to work through a lot of stuff. They've gone through our Reengage ministry. He's working through recovery in Regen right now. They've had to build up trust again and sort of deal with the fallout from the choices he made. He's experienced discipline and pain as a result of his actions, but all of that pain brought him back to Jesus. So you might be sitting here today and you think you're too far gone for God to bring you back. You see yourself on this board over here to my right, and you think there's no way there's grace for what I've done. Or maybe you don't see yourself. Maybe you see someone you know, someone who's turned from God, or they've fallen into sin, or they've fallen so far away you don't see a way back, and so you've stopped reaching out. You've stopped praying for them because you think maybe they've outsinned God's grace. I want to encourage you today to look for areas in your life where you might be limiting God's grace based on the sin you see. I'd also challenge you to look in areas where you might be experiencing some of that discipline from God. It happens. We want to avoid it. But sometimes we deal with consequences for the choices we've made. Remember, those things are happening because God is trying to bring you back to him. He's not trying to pay you back. He's trying to bring you back because his discipline is always meant to bring us back.